My name is Elena Martinez, and I'm 34 years old. I need to tell you this story because if I don't, I think I might disappear entirely into the lie we've been living. People see us and think we have it all figured out. They see the Instagram posts, the coordinated outfits at charity galas, the way David's hand rests possessively on my lower back as we pose for photographers. They see success, beauty, the American dream, wrapped in designer clothing and painted with perfect smiles. What they don't see is how those same hands that guide me so tenderly and publicly leave bruises that I cover with concealer every morning. What they don't hear are the screams that echo through our $1 million home. When the cameras stop rolling and the guests go home. It started so differently. David was charming, successful, everything my mother had dreamed I would find. He owned 3 restaurants in the city, drove a Tesla, and had this way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the world when he looked at me. Our first date was at his flagship restaurant, where he had the chef prepare a special menu just for me. I remember thinking this was what love was supposed to feel like: grand gestures, attention to detail, someone who wanted to show me off. To the world. The proposal came after 8 months of what felt like a fairy tale. He took me to Paris, got down on one knee in front of the Eiffel Tower while a photographer captured every moment. The ring was enormous, a 3-carat diamond that caught the light and threw rainbows across my hand. I said yes without hesitation, drunk on the romance of it all. On the way, other tourists stopped to watch and applaud our moment. The wedding was everything I had dreamed of as a little girl. 300 guests, a dress that cost more than most people make in a year, flowers flown in from Ecuador. David spared no expense, and I felt like a princess walking down that aisle. My father cried when he gave me away, and my mother spent the entire reception telling anyone who would listen how proud she was of the life I was building. But fairy tales don't prepare you for what happens after the cameras stop rolling and real life begins. The first time he raised his voice at me was 3 weeks after we returned from our honeymoon in Bali. I had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning, something that seemed so minor, so easily fixable. But David's face changed in a way I had never seen before. His voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "Elena," he said, his hand gripping my wrist just tight enough to hurt, "when I ask you to do something, I expect it to be done. We have an image to maintain. People are watching us." I apologized profusely, promised it wouldn't happen again, convinced myself that he was just stressed from work. The restaurants were expanding, he was under pressure. This wasn't the real David. The real David was the man who brought me flowers every Friday, who posted pictures of us on social media with captions about how lucky he was to have found his soulmate. The pattern established itself slowly, so gradually that I didn't recognize it was happening. Small criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. Comments about my weight, my clothing choices, the way I laughed too loudly at dinner parties. Always delivered with a smile, always followed by reassurance that he only wanted what was best for me, for us, for our reputation in the community. "You know how much I love you, baby," he would say after pointing out that my dress was perhaps a bit too tight, that maybe I should consider the salad instead of the pasta. "I just want you to be the best version of yourself. We're building something here, and appearances matter." And they did matter. David's business was built on image as much as food quality. The restaurant clientele expected to see the successful owner with his beautiful wife. We were a brand, a lifestyle that people wanted to buy into. I began to understand that my role wasn't just as his wife, but as a crucial component of his business model. The physical violence started small too. A grip on my arm that was too tight when he was making a point. A shove that he claimed was accidental when I was blocking his path to the closet. A slap that he immediately apologized for, claiming he was drunk and didn't know what had come over him. Each incident was followed by apologies, gifts, promises that it would never happen again. But it did happen again and again. And each time, David seemed more convinced that I had somehow provoked it, that if I had just listened better, been more attentive, more understanding of the pressure he was under, none of this would be happening. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though that was terrible enough. The worst part was how good he was at making me believe it was my fault. How he could make me question my own memory of events, my own perception of what had happened. He had this way of rewriting history in real time, of making me feel like I was going crazy for remembering things differently than he did. "You're being dramatic," he would say when I tried to bring up his behavior. "I barely touched you. You're too sensitive, Elena. This is why I worry about you sometimes." And somehow, impossibly, I began to believe him. I started to think that maybe I was being too sensitive, too dramatic, too emotional. Maybe this was just what marriage was like when you were under pressure, when you had responsibilities and appearances to maintain. The isolation happened so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. David had this way of making suggestions that seemed reasonable, even caring. He worried about my friend Sarah being a bad influence, always single and encouraging me to go out drinking when I should be supporting my husband's career. He thought my sister Maria was jealous of our success, always making little comments about our lifestyle, trying to plant seeds of doubt in my mind about our relationship. "I just don't want anyone coming between us," he would say, pulling me close after gently suggesting I cancel another dinner with friends. "We're building something special here, and I need to know you're completely committed to us, to our future together." Slowly, my world began to shrink. Friends stopped calling when I canceled plans too many times. Family gatherings became awkward when David would find reasons for us to leave early or not attend at all. My job at the marketing firm became the next target of his concern. Why did I need to work when he made more than enough money for both of us? Wouldn't it be better if I could focus on supporting his businesses, maybe help with the social media presence, the event planning? "Think about it, Elena," he said one evening as we got ready for bed. "You could be so much more effective helping me build our empire than sitting in some cubicle making other people rich. We could be a real power couple." The idea wasn't entirely unappealing. I was tired of my corporate job, tired of the office politics and meaningless meetings. The thought of working alongside David, of being truly part of his success, felt romantic in a way. I gave my notice the following week. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly my independence would evaporate once I was financially dependent on him. Every purchase had to be justified, every expense scrutinized. The credit cards were in his name. The bank accounts required his approval for large withdrawals. I told myself this was just good financial management, that we were being responsible with our money, but the control extended beyond finances. David had opinions about everything: what I wore, what I ate, how I spent my time, who I talked to. He installed tracking apps on my phone, claiming it was for safety, so he would know where I was in case of an emergency. He went through my emails, my social media messages, always with an explanation that seemed reasonable at the time. "I just want to make sure no one is trying to take advantage of you," he would say when I questioned his need to read my private correspondence. "You're too trusting, Elena. People see what we have and they want to use you to get to me." The gaslighting became more sophisticated too. He would move my things and act confused when I couldn't find them. He would make plans and then claim I have forgotten them, leaving me standing dressed up with nowhere to go while he attended business dinners alone. He would tell me stories about conversations we had supposedly had that I had no memory of, making me question my own sanity. "We talked about this last week," he would insist when I expressed confusion about some decision he had made for both of us. You said you thought it was a great idea. Are you feeling okay lately? You seem to be forgetting a lot of things. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything that happened each day, trying to maintain some grip on reality. But even that became a source of anxiety when David found it one day while I was in the shower. "What is this?" he asked, holding my private thoughts in his hands like evidence of a crime. "Are you documenting our private life?" "Elena, this is concerning. It's like you're building a case against me instead of working on our relationship." I tried to explain that I was just trying to remember things better, that I felt confused sometimes, and writing helped me process my thoughts. But David's expression grew darker as he flipped through the pages, reading my private fears and doubts about our marriage. "This is poison," he said finally, his voice cold and controlled. "This kind of negative thinking is toxic to our relationship. If you're having problems with your memory, maybe you should see a doctor. But this," he held up the journal like it was contaminated, "this has to stop." He made me burn it that night, standing over me as I fed the pages to the fireplace one by one. I watched my words disappear into ash and smoke, feeling like pieces of myself were being consumed along with them. David stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders in what might have looked like comfort to an outside observer but felt like a prison. "We don't keep secrets from each other," he whispered in my ear as the last page curled and blackened. "We're a team, Elena. Teams don't document each other's weaknesses. They support each other, build each other up." The public appearances became more frequent as David's businesses grew. We were invited to charity galas, restaurant openings, society parties. I learned to perfect my smile, to stand at just the right angle for photographs, to make charming small talk that revealed nothing real about our life. I became an expert at applying concealer to bruises, at choosing clothing that covered fingerprint marks on my arms, at timing my smiles perfectly to the camera flash. People envied us. I could see it in their eyes. The wives of other successful men would comment on how romantic David was, how attentive, how lucky I was to have found such a devoted husband. They noticed how he never left my side at parties, how his hand was always somewhere on my body, my back, my arm, my waist, maintaining constant contact. They interpreted this as affection, as a man who couldn't bear to be separated from his beloved wife. They didn't recognize it as surveillance, as control, as a constant reminder that I belonged to him, and that any attempt to move away, to have a private conversation, to exist independently for even a moment, would be noted and later questioned. They saw romance where I felt imprisonment, devotion where I experienced possession. The screaming matches at home became more frequent and more intense. David's anger would build throughout the day over small perceived slights or failures, and then explode once we were safely behind closed doors. A wrong word to a business associate, a smile that was too friendly to a waiter, a moment of fatigue that made me less than perfectly charming at a dinner party. Any of these could trigger hours of verbal assault. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October, 18 months after our wedding. David had been particularly stressed about a review from a prominent food critic who was expected to visit one of his restaurants that week. I had spent the day helping coordinate with the chef, ensuring every detail was perfect, but nothing I did seemed to be enough. When he came home that night, I could see the tension radiating from him before he even spoke. His jaw was clenched, his movements sharp and aggressive as he threw his keys onto the kitchen counter with more force than necessary. I had learned to read these signs, to brace myself for what was coming. The florist screwed up the centerpieces, he announced without preamble, not even bothering with a greeting. The arrangements I specifically ordered for the critic's table looked like something from a gas station. "Do you know how this reflects on me? On us?" I tried to calm him down, to suggest solutions, but my words only seemed to fuel his anger. He began recounting every small failure from the day, every minor imperfection that had somehow become my fault. The hostess had seated someone at the wrong table. The sommelier had recommended a wine that was slightly too expensive for what the customer ordered. A server had been 30 seconds late delivering bread to table 6. "This is what happens when I can't trust you to handle the simple things," he said, his voice rising with each word. "I ask you to coordinate one day, and everything falls apart. I should have known better than to rely on you for something this important." The accusation was so unfair, so completely disconnected from reality, that something inside me finally snapped. For the first time in months, I found my voice. "That's not fair, David," I said, standing up from the couch where I had been listening to his tirade. "I did exactly what you asked me to do. I called the florist 3 times to confirm the order. I checked with the staff about the seating arrangements. You can't blame me for every single thing that goes wrong in your restaurants." The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. David's face went completely still, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than his shouting had been. He walked toward me slowly, deliberately, and I could see something dangerous flickering behind his eyes. "What did you just say to me?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the air like a blade. I tried to backtrack, to apologize, but it was too late. The challenge to his authority, however mild, had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His hand struck my face with such force that I stumbled backward, my cheek burning with pain and shock. But this time was different. This time, he didn't stop with one slap. The rage that had been building all day, maybe all week, found its release in violence that was more brutal than anything that had come before. I tried to protect myself, to get away, but he grabbed my wrist and yanked me back, his grip so tight. I could feel the bones grinding together. "You don't get to disrespect me in my own house," he snarled, his face inches from mine. "I work 16 hours a day to give you this life, to give you everything you could possibly want, and this is how you repay me? By questioning my judgment? By talking back to me like some ungrateful child?" What followed was the longest and most terrifying 20 minutes of my life. David's anger seemed to have no bottom, no limit. Every perceived slight, every moment of supposed disrespect from the past months came pouring out in a torrent of verbal and physical abuse. He shoved me against the wall, grabbed my shoulders, and shook me until my teeth rattled, screamed accusations and insults inches from my face. It was finally over when his rage had exhausted itself. I was crumpled on the floor of our living room, my body aching and my spirit completely broken. David stood over me, breathing heavily, his appearance disheveled and wild. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, as suddenly as the storm had begun, it was over. David's expression shifted, the monster disappearing behind the mask of the man I had fallen in love with. He knelt beside me, his voice soft and concerned, his hands gentle as they reached for me. "Oh God, Elena, I'm so sorry," he whispered, trying to help me sit up. I don't know what came over me. The stress, the pressure, it's no excuse. I know that. Please, baby, let me help you. Let me take care of you. And despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the complete violation of trust, I let him help me to the bathroom, let him clean the blood from my split lip, let him bring me ice for the bruises that were already forming. I let him hold me while I cried, let him whisper apologies and promises into my hair, because where else was I going to go? I had no job, no money of my own, no friends I hadn't pushed away, no family I hadn't distanced myself from. My entire Life had become so intertwined with David's that I couldn't imagine how to separate myself from it. And more than that, I still loved him. Despite everything, I loved the man he could be when he wasn't consumed by rage and control. The next morning, David brought me breakfast in bed, my favorite croissants from the French bakery downtown. Fresh strawberries, coffee made exactly the way I liked it. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched me eat, his eyes filled with what looked like genuine remorse. "I've been thinking all night," he said quietly, "about what happened, about how we got here. I think we need help, Elena. I think we need to see someone to talk about how to handle the stress better, how to communicate without things getting out of hand." The suggestion of therapy felt like a lifeline, a sign that he recognized how serious our problems had become. I agreed immediately, desperately hopeful that this could be the turning point, the moment when we finally started healing our relationship instead of destroying it. David's version of therapy was carefully controlled, just like everything else in our life. He chose the therapist, a colleague of his friend who specialized in helping successful couples navigate the unique pressures of high-profile relationships. Dr. Hartwell was polished and professional, but I sensed immediately that his loyalties lay more with preserving marriages than with protecting the individuals within them. In our sessions, David was articulate and charming, painting a picture of a relationship under stress from external pressures rather than internal dysfunction. He spoke eloquently about the challenges of building a business empire, but told that public scrutiny took on both of us, the way that success could sometimes create unrealistic expectations. "Elena is incredibly supportive," he would say, reaching over to take my hand as we sat on Dr. Hartwell's expensive leather couch. "But I worry that I'm asking too much of her, expecting her to be my partner in business as well as in life. The pressure can be overwhelming for both of us." The therapy sessions became another performance, another stage where David and I played our roles as the devoted couple working through temporary difficulties. Dr. Hartwell gave us exercises in communication, techniques for managing stress, homework, assignments about expressing our needs more clearly. David embraced it all with the same intensity he brought to everything else, turning our relationship into another project to be perfected. At home, he would quiz me about what we had discussed in session, making sure our stories aligned, our presentations consistent. He bought books about healthy relationships and would read passages aloud, explaining how we could apply these principles to our situation. It felt like he was studying marriage the way he had once studied restaurant management, learning the correct terminology and techniques without truly understanding the underlying emotions. "Communication is key," he would say, repeating Dr. Hartwell's words. "We need to be able to express our frustrations before they build up to a breaking point." That's what happened that night, Elena. I let my stress accumulate instead of talking to you about it. The violence didn't stop, but it became more calculated, more strategic. David learned to target areas that wouldn't show, to time his outbursts for when we wouldn't be seen in public for several days. He became expert at reading my body language, knowing exactly how far he could push before I might break and tell someone the truth, and I became expert at hiding. Not just the physical evidence of his abuse, but the emotional damage that was slowly eating away at my sense of self. I perfected the art of applying makeup to cover fingerprint bruises on my upper arms, learned which clothing styles best concealed the marks on my collarbone, developed an entire wardrobe strategy around concealment. The isolation intensified too. David convinced me that most people wouldn't understand the pressures we faced, that our relationship was too complex, too unique for ordinary people to comprehend. He painted us as special, elite, operating on a level that required different rules and different sacrifices. "Look at power couples throughout history," he would say during one of his philosophical moments. Do you think they achieved greatness by following conventional wisdom about relationships? Success requires sacrifice, Alina. It requires both partners to be completely committed to the vision, even when that means making difficult choices. My family began to express concern that David had prepared for this too. He documented my mood, swings, my moments of tearfulness, my increasing social withdrawal, building a case that I was struggling with depression and anxiety. When my sister Maria called to check on me, David would answer the phone and speak to her in concerned, loving tones about how worried he was about my mental health. "She's been having a really hard time lately," he would say, his voice heavy with manufactured concern. The pressure of the social obligations, the business responsibilities, I think it's all been too much for her. I'm trying to encourage her to see someone, maybe get some medication to help with the anxiety. When I did speak to Maria, David would sit nearby, listening to every word, his presence a constant reminder that my conversations were being monitored. I found myself parroting his explanations, agreeing that I was struggling with stress, that David was being wonderfully supportive during this difficult time. "He's been so patient with me," I would tell her, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I don't know what I would do without him. The truth was that I was starting to believe his version of reality. When you're told repeatedly that you're unstable, emotional, unreliable, you begin to doubt your own perceptions. When every reaction you have is labeled as an overreaction, every concern dismissed as paranoia, you start to think that maybe you really are the problem. Dr. Hartwell reinforced this narrative, albeit unintentionally. He focused on my emotional responses, my tendency to become upset during our sessions when discussing difficult topics. He suggested techniques for managing my anxiety, prescribed breathing exercises for when I felt overwhelmed. The subtext was clear. I was the volatile one, the one who needed to be managed and controlled. Elena has always been very sensitive, David would explain when I broke down crying during a particularly difficult session. She feels things very deeply, which is one of the things I love about her, but it can also make it hard for her to cope with stress. Even my physical reactions became evidence of my instability. When I flinched away from David's touch during one session, Dr. Hartwell interpreted it as a sign of my anxiety rather than a natural response to someone who had hurt me. When I had trouble sleeping and developed dark circles under my eyes, it was seen as a symptom of depression rather than the result of living in constant fear. The medical gaslighting extended beyond therapy. David convinced me to see his personal physician, Dr. Richardson, about my mood issues. Dr. Richardson was cut from the same cloth as Dr. Hartwell, professional, expensive, and more interested in maintaining relationships with wealthy clients than in asking difficult questions. "Mrs. Martinez," he said during my first appointment, barely looking up from his notes, "your husband is concerned about your emotional state. He mentions that you've been having difficulty sleeping, episodes of crying, some memory issues. These can all be symptoms of depression or anxiety disorders." I tried to explain that my problems weren't chemical but situational, that I was living in a constant state of stress because of my home environment, that Dr. Richardson had already made up his mind. Guided by David's carefully crafted narrative of a loving husband worried about his unstable wife. "Stress can certainly exacerbate mental health issues," he said, writing out a prescription. "But the underlying cause is likely biochemical. These medications should help stabilize your mood, make it easier for you to cope with the pressures in your life. The antidepressants made everything worse. They dulled my emotions, making it even harder to trust my instincts about what was happening to me. The fog that settled over my thoughts made it easier for David to manipulate my perceptions, to convince me that my memories were unreliable, my reactions inappropriate. You seem so much calmer now," he would say, stroking my hair as I sat zombie-like on our couch, staring at nothing. The medication is really helping you. I can see the difference, but I wasn't calmer. I was disappearing. The person I had been before David, the woman with opinions and boundaries and dreams of her own, was dissolving under the weight of chemical suppression and psychological manipulation. I was becoming exactly what he wanted, a beautiful, compliant accessory to his success story. The worst part was that I was starting to be grateful for it. The numbness was easier than the constant fear and pain. Being empty was preferable to being full of emotions I wasn't allowed to express. I was learning to find comfort in my own disappearance, relief in the gradual extinction of my authentic self. 2 years into our marriage, David's restaurant empire had expanded to include 5 locations across the city. With success came even more public scrutiny, more events to attend, more performances to give. I had become expert at playing my role. The supportive wife, the gracious hostess, the perfect complement to his ambition. But the cost of maintaining this facade was becoming unbearable. The medication had turned me into a shadow of myself, but David loved this new version of me. I was pliable, agreeable, rarely questioning his decisions or pushing back against his demands. At public events, I floated through conversations like a ghost, smiling and nodding at appropriate moments while feeling completely disconnected from everything around me. "You're glowing tonight," people would tell me at charity galas, mistaking my medicated haze for serenity. Marriage suits you so well. If they only knew that the glow they saw was the sheen of pharmaceutical suppression, the appearance of contentment created by numbing every genuine emotion I might have felt. I had become a living mannequin, beautifully dressed and positioned for maximum effect, but hollow inside. David's control had evolved too. He no longer needed to use physical violence as frequently because he had found more subtle ways to keep me in line. The threat was always there, lurking beneath his charming exterior. But now he could control me with a look, a tone of voice, a carefully placed comment about my stability or my medication compliance. "Elena forgot to take her pills this morning," he would say with a laugh when I showed any sign of independent thought or emotional response. "She gets a little scattered when she's off her routine." The comment would be delivered as a loving observation from a concerned husband, but I understood. The message: step out of line, and everyone will be reminded that you're mentally unstable, that your perceptions can't be trusted, that your husband is the only one keeping you functional. My relationship with my family had deteriorated to the point where we barely spoke anymore. The few phone calls we did have were stilted, uncomfortable affairs where I struggled to sound normal while David monitored every word. Maria had stopped trying to visit after David made it clear that her presence upset me too much, that I needed peace and quiet to manage my condition. "She means wow," he would say after declining another invitation on my behalf. "But Elena's in such a fragile state right now. Too much stimulation just sends her into a spiral." I wanted to scream, to tell them that I wasn't fragile, that I was being systematically destroyed by the man they all thought was saving me, but the words wouldn't come. The medication made it hard to access my anger, hard to feel anything strongly enough to fight back. And even if I could have found the words, who'd have believed me? David had crafted such a convincing narrative of my instability that even I was starting to doubt my own version of events. When I tried to remember the early days of our relationship, the memories felt fuzzy, unreliable. Had he really been as controlling as I remembered, or was that just my depression talking? Had the violence been as bad as it seemed at the time, or was I being dramatic like he always said? The gaslighting had become so pervasive that I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. David would deny conversations we had just had, claim I had agreed to things I was certain I had opposed, insist that events had happened differently than I remembered them. Between the medication and the constant psychological manipulation, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality entirely. "I'm worried about your memory," he said one evening after I questioned his account of a conversation with Dr. Richardson. "You've been forgetting things a lot lately. Maybe we need to adjust your medication again." The threat was subtle but clear. If I continued to challenge his version of reality, he would have me medicated into even greater compliance. I had seen what happened to women who were labeled as difficult, as unstable. They disappeared into psychiatric facilities or became so heavily medicated that they might as well have been zombies. I started to wonder if maybe David was right about me. Maybe I was unstable, unreliable, too emotional to be trusted with my own perceptions. Maybe the person I thought I had been before our marriage was just a fantasy, a collection of delusions brought on by untreated mental illness. Maybe David really was trying to help me, trying to save me from myself. The thought was terrifying and comforting at the same time. If I was really as broken as he claimed, then at least I wasn't responsible for my own destruction. I could stop fighting. Stop trying to hold on to memories and perceptions that might not be real anyway. I could surrender completely to his version of reality and find peace in my own erasure. But late at night, when the medication wore thin and David was asleep beside me, I would sometimes catch glimpses of my former self. I would remember what it felt like to have opinions, to make decisions, to exist as a complete person rather than as an extension of someone else's will. Those moments of clarity were both precious and painful, reminders of everything I had lost and everything I might never get back. I began to fantasize about death, not as an escape from David, but as an escape from myself, from the confusion and uncertainty that had become my constant companions. The idea of simply not existing anymore seemed like mercy, like the ultimate relief from the exhausting work of trying to figure out what was real and what was manipulation. David must have sensed my thoughts because he began to monitor me even more closely, checking my pill bottles to make sure I wasn't stockpiling medication, watching for signs that I might be planning something desperate. His vigilance was framed as concern, as love, as the dedication of a husband who couldn't bear to lose his beloved wife to her own demons. "I don't know what I would do without you," he would whisper in my ear as he held me close, his arms feeling more like restraints than comfort. "You're everything to me, Elena. Promise me you'll never leave me. Promise me you'll always let me take care of you." And I would promise because what else could I do? I had no money, no friends, no family. I could turn to no sense of self strong enough to imagine an independent existence. I was trapped not just by David's control, but by my own inability to conceive of any other way of being. The restaurants continued to thrive, and our public image became even more polished. Food critics praised not just the quality of David's establishments, but the elegance of his wife, the grace with which I moved through our social obligations. We were featured in lifestyle magazines, photographed at charity events, held up as an example of successful modern partnership. Nobody saw the empty woman behind the beautiful smile, the medicated shell of the person who had once dreamed of her own life, her own achievements, her own identity. They saw what David wanted them to see: the perfect wife, the ideal complement to masculine ambition, the living proof that he was not just successful but beloved. The first crack in David's perfect facade came from an unexpected source. His youngest brother Marcus, whom I had met only a handful of times, showed up at our house unannounced on a Sunday afternoon. David was at the restaurant dealing with a crisis involving a broken walk-in freezer, and I was alone, which almost never happened anymore. When the doorbell rang, my first instinct was panic. David didn't like unexpected visitors. And he especially didn't like me dealing with family members without him present to control the conversation. But Marcus looks so much like a younger version of my husband that I opened the door without. Thinking, Elena, he said, his smile warm but his eyes concerned. I was hoping to catch David, but maybe it's better that it's just you. Can I come in? I hesitated, knowing that David would be angry if he found out I had let Marcus into our house without permission. But something in his expression, a gentleness I rarely saw in David anymore, made me step aside and let him enter. Marcus was 26, 8 years younger than David, and he had the same dark hair and sharp jawline, but none of the calculating coldness that had developed in my husband's eyes over the years. He looked around our perfectly appointed living room with what seemed like sadness rather than admiration. "This place is beautiful," he said, but his tone suggested he found something troubling about the beauty. Very David, everything exactly where it should be. I offered him coffee, going through the motions of hostess behavior that had become automatic. But as I moved around the kitchen, I became aware that he was watching me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Not the possessive surveillance I was used to from David, but something more like concern. "Elena," he said finally, accepting the cup I handed him. "Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" The question was so unexpected, so direct, that for a moment I couldn't find my rehearsed response about being fine, about being grateful for David's care and support. The medication made it hard to access my emotions quickly, but something stirred. In my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in months. "I'm fine," I said automatically, but my voice sounded strange even to my ears. "David takes very good care of me." Marcus set down his coffee cup and looked at me more closely. "You don't look fine. You look—" He paused, searching for words. "You look like you're disappearing." The observation hit me like a physical blow. Nobody had seen me, really seen me, in so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be perceived as a person rather than as an object or a problem to be managed. Tears started in my eyes before I could stop them, and I quickly turned away, trying to compose myself. "I'm sorry," I said, wiping my face. "I've been having some emotional issues. David's been helping me manage them." "What kind of emotional issues?" Marcus's voice was gentle but persistent. "Because from where I'm sitting, you look like someone who's been systematically broken down." The words hung in the air between us like a diagnosis I hadn't been brave enough to make myself. I wanted to deny it, to recite the story David had taught me about depression and anxiety and chemical imbalances. But something about Marcus's directness, his refusal to accept the surface explanation, cracked something open inside me. "I don't know," I whispered, the first honest words I had spoken in months. "I don't know what's wrong with me anymore. I can't remember how I used to be, who I used to be. Everything feels foggy, like I'm living someone else's life." Marcus moved closer, his expression growing more serious. "Elena, has David ever hurt you? Physically, I mean?" The question should have been easy to answer, but I found myself frozen. The medication made it hard to access clear memories, and David's constant reframing of events had left me uncertain about what had actually happened versus what I might have imagined or exaggerated. "He gets stressed sometimes," I said carefully. "The business pressure, but he's never, nothing serious." Even as I said it, I could feel the lie sitting heavy in my mouth. Marcus's expression told me he wasn't buying it either. "I grew up with David," he said quietly. "I know what he's capable of when he doesn't get his way. Our father was the same way, charming in public, controlling at home. I watched him break our mother down piece by piece until she was just a shadow." The parallel hit too close to home. I thought about David's parents, how his mother always seemed nervous around his father, how she rarely spoke unless spoken to, how she had that same medicated distance in her eyes that I saw in my own mirror. David isn't like that, I said, but the words felt hollow. He loves me. He takes care of me. Love doesn't look like this, Elena. Marcus gestured at me, at my careful posture, my muted responses, the way I kept glancing toward the door as if expecting David to appear. This looks like control. This looks like someone who's been trained to disappear. Before I could respond, I heard David's car in the driveway. The sound sent immediate panic through my system, and I knew Marcus saw it in my face. He stood up quickly, understanding that his time was limited. "I'm going to give you my number," he said, pulling out his phone. "I want you to memorize it, not save it. If you ever need help, if you ever want to talk to someone who understands what David is really like, call me." He recited the number twice, while I committed it to memory, then headed for the door just as David's key turned in the lock. The timing was too close, and I knew there would be questions. David entered with his usual commanding presence, his eyes immediately taking in the scene, the 2 coffee cups, Marcus's coat still in his hand, my obvious distress. "Marcus," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "What a surprise. I didn't know you were planning to visit." "I was in the neighborhood," Marcus replied easily, but I could see the tension between the brothers. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you both We're doing very well," David said, moving to stand behind me, his hands settling on my shoulders in what looked like affection but felt like ownership. "Elena's been having some health issues, so we're keeping things quiet these days." "So I gathered," Marcus said, his eyes meeting mine briefly. "Well, I should let you get back to your evening. Elena, it was good to see you again." After Marcus left, David's questioning began immediately. What had we talked about? How long had he been there? Had I mentioned anything about our private life, our relationship, my medication? His tone was casual, but I could feel the danger underneath. "He seemed concerned about something," David said, watching my face carefully. "Did you say anything to worry him?" "No, I lied. We just made small talk." He asked how the restaurants were doing. David studied me for a long moment, then seemed to decide I was telling the truth, but his vigilance increased after that day. He started coming home at unexpected times, checking in more frequently when he was away, monitoring my phone usage more closely. "I don't want you seeing Marcus again without me present," he said a few days later, framing it as concern for my well-being. "He's going through some issues right now, and I don't want his instability affecting your recovery." But Marcus's words had planted a seed that even my medication couldn't completely suppress. For the first time in months, I began to question whether my situation was really about my mental health or about something else entirely. The doubt was small and fragile, but it was there, growing quietly in the spaces between David's surveillance. The changes in my awareness were subtle at first. I began to notice things I had trained myself to ignore, the way David's jaw tightened when I spoke to other people, how his hand on my back could guide me away from conversations before they became too personal, the careful way he monitored every interaction I had with the outside world. I started paying attention to my medication routine, really looking at the pills David handed me each morning and evening. There seemed to be more of them than Dr. Richardson had originally prescribed, different shapes and colors that I didn't remember discussing. When I asked David about it, he explained that Dr. Richardson had adjusted my dosage to help with my anxiety and memory issues. "You've been so much better lately," he said, stroking my hair as I swallowed the pills. "More stable, more like yourself. The doctor thinks we found the right combination, but I didn't feel like myself. I felt like a heavily sedated version of someone I used to know, going through the motions of life without truly experiencing any of it." The woman who had once had opinions about movies and books and politics had been replaced by someone who nodded agreeably at whatever David suggested. We think about any given topic. Marcus's phone number stayed in my memory like a lifeline I wasn't sure I had the courage to use. Sometimes I would repeat it to myself while David was at work, making sure I hadn't forgotten any digits. But actually calling him felt impossibly dangerous, like crossing a line that would expose me to consequences. I couldn't imagine. The opportunity came during one of David's rare business trips. He was flying to Chicago to meet with potential investors for a new restaurant location and would be gone for 3 days. Before he left, he made sure I had enough medication to last while he was away, arranged for groceries to be delivered, and enlisted Mrs. Chun, our elderly neighbor, to check on me each day. "I worry about leaving you alone," he said, holding me close at the airport. "Promise me you'll take your medication on schedule, that you'll call me if you start feeling anxious or confused." I promised, kissing him goodbye and waving as he disappeared through security. But as soon as I got home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of choice. For 72 hours, no one would be monitoring my movements, my conversations, my thoughts. I waited until the second day, until I was sure David was settled into his meetings and wouldn't be calling unexpectedly. Then I walked to the coffee shop 3 blocks from our house and used the payphone outside, my hands shaking as I dialed Marcus's number. "Alina?" His voice was surprised but warm. "Are you okay? Where are you calling from?" "David's out of town," I said quietly, looking around to make sure no one was watching. "I need to ask you something about the medication I'm taking. Do you think there might be too much of it?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear Marcus choosing his words carefully. "What makes you ask that?" "I feel like I'm disappearing," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "Like I'm watching my life happen to someone else. And I can't remember things clearly anymore, can't trust my own thoughts." "Elena, listen to me carefully. I think you need to talk to a doctor, someone who isn't connected to David. Can you do that?" The suggestion terrified me. David had made it clear that Dr. Richardson was the only physician qualified to understand my complex condition, that seeking other opinions would just confuse my treatment and set back my progress. "I don't know," I said. "David says Dr. Richardson is the best, that other doctors wouldn't understand my situation." "That's what David says," Marcus replied gently. "But what do you think? Do you feel like Dr. Richardson listens to you, treats you like a person instead of a problem to be managed?" The question forced me to confront something I had been avoiding. Dr. Richardson had never really looked at me during our appointments, had never asked what I wanted or how I felt about my treatment. He took David's reports about my condition and adjusted my medication accordingly, as if I were a test subject rather than a patient. "I'm scared," I whispered into the phone. "I'm scared of what David will do if he finds out I'm questioning things." "Do you have somewhere you could go if you needed to leave quickly?" Marcus asked. "Family, friends, anywhere David wouldn't look." "For you." The question revealed the depth of my isolation. I had no close friends left, no family members I felt I could trust with the truth. David had been so successful in portraying me as unstable that I wasn't sure anyone would believe me if I tried to explain what my life had really become. "I don't think so," I said, feeling the hopelessness wash over me again. "Elena, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to give you the name and address of a women's clinic downtown. They have doctors there who specialize in helping women in situations like yours. You don't need an appointment, you don't need insurance. You just need to walk in and ask for help." He gave me the information, and I repeated it back to him until I had it memorized. Then he said something that stayed with me long after I hung up the phone. "Whatever David has told you about yourself, Whatever he's convinced you to believe about your own mind and your own perceptions, I want you to consider the possibility that you were right the first time, that your instincts about your own life are more accurate than his explanations. That night, I sat in our empty house and tried to remember who I had been before David. It was like trying to see through thick fog. But occasionally, I would catch glimpses of the woman I used to be. Someone who had laughed easily, who had strong opinions about things that mattered to her, who had plans and dreams that had nothing to do with supporting someone else's ambitions. I looked at the pills David had left for me, the careful daily doses arranged in a weekly organizer. Instead of taking them, I poured them down the toilet and flushed them away. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt monumental. For the first time in months, I fell asleep without chemical assistance. My dreams were vivid and strange, full of memories I had thought were lost forever. I dreamed about the woman I had been before David, and when I woke up the next morning, I could remember her face clearly.